G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to Magztv. So a few weeks ago we unboxed a new Galax GTX 1070 Extreme Overclock Sniper here on the channel, and today we're going to run this beastie little card through its paces. But first, what is it? The Galax GTX 1070 Extreme Overclock Sniper is a high-end variant of the GTX 1070 featuring 1920 CUDA cores, a custom-built PCB and 8GB of GDDR5 memory running at 8000 MHz. It also features a boosted core clock speed of up to 1784 MHz. In non-VR applications, this card supports 4K displays at 120Hz, 5K displays at 60Hz, and 8K displays at 60Hz by using a pair of connection cables. However, for this video we'll only be looking at 1080p, 1440p, and VR performance of the card. The card is also beautifully designed, with its casing ending in the shape of the Galax crown, with RGB lighting plate located in the back of the card that can be customized to almost any color using the Galax software. A full list of the Galax GTX 1070 EXOC specs can be found in the video description below, along with the specs for my personal PC on which the testing was done. This video, as I mentioned before, will include a series of tests for a number of game titles ranging from The Witcher 3 to DCS World 2.0 on the NTTR map, both in 1080p and 440p resolutions, before ending in a number of VR tests. But first, let's set a baseline. 3D Mark is one of the most well-known pieces of benchmarking software known and has been in use for years. Running the card through the benchmark test Time Spy netted us an overall score of 5,735 with a CPU score of 5,024 and a graphics score of 5,895. We'll come back to VR Mark later in this video. So starting off the testing, we have GTA 5. Running the Ultra preset with MXAA enabled netted us a solid 138 frames per second at 1080p while managing to average a stable FPS of 92 with the occasional dip down to 87 noted during heavy gameplay. At 1440p, the 1070 EXOC still managed to clear 100 frames per second with an average stable FPS of 78. Once again, during heavy gameplay this would drop as far down as 64 frames, but rarely lasted longer than a second. Next up we have IL-2 The Battle of Stalingrad at max settings. This flight simulation is well known for not being ideal in regards to optimization, which makes it fantastic to see what a 1070 can do in a non-optimized environment. In 1080p, the 1070 EXOC still managed to punch over 100 FPS, hitting 111 frames at its highest, while averaging a fantastic 96. In 1440p, it topped out at 93 frames per second while maintaining a respectable 88 frames average. Star Citizen, not a game you will often see on benchmarks, as the current public builds are well known for having netcode issues that affect FPS, along with VSync being enabled by default. However, if you jump into Arena Commander single player, netcode is removed from the equation, and a quick visit to the game's console will disable both VSync and motion blur effects for this ambitious alpha. In this environment, Star Citizen cracked 95 FPS on max settings while maintaining 78 frames average at 1080p, while hitting 81 frames per second with a 68 frame average at 1440. War Thunder Air Forces. As almost the polar opposite to IL-2, War Thunder is well known for being amazingly well optimized for both normal resolutions and VR. Using the movie preset in the skies over Norway, the 1070 EXOC cracked out a massive 217 frames per second with an average frame rate of 184 at 1080p. At 1440p, the card was able to punch out 197 FPS max and maintain an average of 174 frames per second. Once again back in War Thunder, but this time with Ground Forces, War Thunder's tank gameplay mode. This is much more intensive on the cards. On the Normandy map, again using the movie preset, frame rate maxed out at 176 at 1080p with an average of 150. Interestingly, the 1440p was not far behind at 169 FPS max and 147 FPS on average. The Witcher 3, present in almost all recent benchmarks of all of the 10 series cards, and well, this video is not going to be any different. At max settings with hairworks off, the 1070 EXOC recorded a maximum frame rate of 92 while maintaining an average of 87 at 1080p, while pushing out 74 with an average of 61 at 1440. Turning hairworks on, the 1070 still managed a 71 frame per second with average of 65 at 1080p, maxing out at 59 frames per second and dropping down to 50 at 1440. And last of all in these tests, DCS World 2.0 on the Nevada Test and Training Range map. Using the high preset at 1080p, DCS rocked out a maximum frame rate of 178 frames per second with an average of 110. Frame rates, however, did dip down as low as 98 at a max speed pass through the Las Vegas Strip. At 1440p, we hit 148 frames per second with an average of 101 frames, but again saw our greatest dip passing through Las Vegas, hitting 73 frames per second on the Strip. So next up we move on to virtual reality. I first got into VR entirely for the immersion factor in flight simulation software, so this section, rather than being a broad benchmark, will simply be a look at the expected performance over a number of popular combat flight titles that I cover here on Magztv. It's also worth noting that testing in VR can be difficult due to the technology being somewhat new, and as such performance differences can arise both from program optimization as well as varying slightly depending on what HMD is in use. To address that last issue, I've managed to get a loan of an Oculus Rift CV1 and a HTC Vive to go with my own personal Razer HDK2 open source virtual reality headset. These three headsets represent the three major players in the current PC VR market. Due to the varying capabilities of these three headsets, all tests will be performed exclusively in sit-down experiences, with the target frame rate of these tests being an FPS of 90. While being completely playable at lower frame rates, 90 FPS is the recommended frame rate to minimize the effects of potential motion sickness experienced by some VR users. On a final note, what is displayed on the monitor for recording and what is displayed on the VR HMD can vary slightly, appearing unstable or distorted. This is usually the effect of motion tracking and in some programs stretching the mirror of the HMD image to fit the standard resolution of a monitor. So, anyways, onto the tests. First up, VRMark. 3D Mark's new VR benchmarking software features two tests, the Orange Room and the Blue Room. Boiled down, the Orange Room is a test of general VR performance, so to make sure your PC is ready for VR, while the Blue Room is a high-intensity VR test environment, rendering VR at 5K. It's designed to judge the expected performance on the most intense VR titles on the market, while also being ready to test future hardware generations. It represents the single most demanding VR benchmark available at this time. In the Orange Room, the 1070 EXOC managed a score of 10,275 and a frame rate of 223.95, well above the requirement for the pass in this room. However, the Blue Room drew it to its limit with a score of only 1,895 and an average frame rate of 41.3, notably less than the 100 FPS target of that room. Translated into game performance, War Thunder Air Forces, an extremely well optimized title as mentioned before and one of the earliest titles to take up VR beginning back in the Oculus Rift DK1 days, rocked out 90 FPS across the board on all three headsets at movie settings. Although an occasional 1 or 2 frame rate drop was noted, these seemed to be unrelated to anything happening within the game environment and were rare enough to not affect the results. War Thunder Ground Forces, on the other hand, didn't perform quite so well. At max settings, the Rift hit a maximum frame rate of 42 with an average of 38, the Vive did slightly better at 44, again with an average of 38, with the HDK2 falling slightly behind the Big 2 with a max frame rate of 37 and an average of 31 frames per second. That being said, dropping to minimum settings again brought the Rift and the Vive up to a stable 90-90 with the HDK2's performance slightly behind at 90 FPS max with an 87 FPS average. Next up, IL-2. IL-2's VR support is somewhat new and, as with the 1080 and 1440p tests, not perfectly optimized at this time. At maximum settings, the Galax GTX 1070 EXOC was able to push the Rift to a maximum of 47 frames per second with an average of 43 FPS, the Vive to 48, again with a 43 FPS average. The HDK2 once again was lagging a little bit behind with a 42 frame max and a 38 frame average. Interestingly, dropping to minimal graphics settings noted a drop in performance rather than an increase. Just to confirm that this was unrelated to the card and in fact an engine optimization problem, I contacted 2 other VR users and had them test the performance as well on 2 separate systems. System 1 was an Intel i7-6700K with 16GB of memory running an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Founders Edition on the Oculus Rift and resulted in an average frame rate of 51 FPS. The second system is a Ryzen 7 1700 at 3.8 GHz, 16GB of RAM, and an AMD R9 Fury X, and reported an average of 42 FPS. So the limitation here does in fact seem to be a VR optimization problem and not related to the hardware itself. It is also worth noting that there was some stuttering in the cockpit while using the HDK2 during flights on IL-2. This stuttering was not present on the Rift or the Vive. And last of all, our final VR run through. This is DCS World 2.0 on the NTTR map at the high preset once again. This is an interesting test, as DCS is actually rather well optimized, but also one of the most demanding VR titles I've ever encountered. On the Rift, DCS maxed out at 53 frames per second, 52 on the Vive and 48 on the HDK2, with an average FPS of all headsets sitting in the 40s. Dropping back to the low preset pushed the Rift back up to 67 frames per second, 69 for the Vive and 58 for the HDK2, with average frame rates between the Rift and the Vive being almost identical. So with that quick look at VR performance, the last things to really note about the GTX 1070 EXOC is noise and temperatures. Even in VR applications, I was never able to push the Galax 1070 EXOC Sniper over 69 degrees Celsius in a fully air-cooled environment, with fans only ever increasing to a maximum of 83% during the DCS high settings flight. And noise-wise, while I don't have a dB meter available to give accurate numbers, the card was almost silent during all of the performance tests. So after all that, what's my opinions of the card? Well, the Galax GTX 1070 Extreme Overclock Sniper is a bloody good card for those looking for cost-effective performance in 1080p and 1440p applications, with good frame rates in most standard and designed for VR titles, and I expect it would perform well in 4K testing, although I was unable to try this myself. And by cost effective, the Galax 1070 EXOC retails in Australia for around $650, while having similar RAM and clock performance to many of the lower budgeted GTX 1080 cards that start around $750 and rapidly jump to over $800 Australian dollars. If you're looking for a fantastic performance at a cost effective price, as far as 10 series cards go, the 1070 EXOC Sniper may be what you're looking for. That being said, users interested in high frame rate, high intensity VR titles such as DCS World 2.0 with the settings dialed up would likely be better off holding onto their coin for a 1080 Titanium or possibly even a Titan card. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed the video on my first ever card review on the channel. Remember to click that like button and subscribe if you want to see more hardware reviews or check out my other content. Also, if you would like to help support the channel, please feel free to check out my Patreon page, links on screen and in the video description down below. And as always, fly smart, fly safe, and I will catch you in the skies.